The Hawker Typhoon didn't start its life as a legend, it started as a death trap. In 1941, the Royal Air Force was desperate for a high-altitude interceptor that could catch the newest German fighters, and on paper, the Typhoon was a masterpiece of brute force. It was built around the Napier Sabre, a monstrous 24-cylinder engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower, a figure unheard of at the time. But the moment the Typhoon left the drawing board and entered the sky, everything went wrong. It was a 7-ton mechanical disaster that seemed to hate the men who flew it. The engine was so temperamental that it often burst into flames before the pilot even left the runway, and the massive 4-bladed propeller created so much torque that the plane would violently swing during takeoff, flipping over and crushing anyone inside. But the most terrifying glitch wasn't the engine, it was the tail. As pilots pushed the Typhoon into high-speed dives, a catastrophic structural resonance would occur. Without any warning, the entire rear section of the fuselage would simply snap off, leaving the pilot in a cockpit that was now a 400-mile-per-hour coffin plummeting toward the earth. In the first few months of service, more Typhoon pilots were killed by their own aircraft than by the Luftwaffe. Even if the tail stayed on, the cockpit was a gas chamber. The engine's exhaust leaked so much carbon monoxide into the cabin that pilots had to breathe 100% pure oxygen from the moment they started the engine just to stay conscious. The Typhoon was a failure at high altitudes, too. Its massive, thick wings, designed to carry heavy cannons, created so much drag that it couldn't perform the very job it was built for. It was too heavy to climb, too unstable to dogfight, and too dangerous to trust. By 1942, the British Air Ministry had seen enough. The order was being drafted to scrap the entire program and send the 7-ton Sledgehammer to the junkyard. The Hawker Typhoon was officially a disgrace, a billion-pound mistake that had cost the lives of dozens of elite pilots for zero combat results. But just as the axe was about to fall, a group of desperate commanders realized that the Typhoon's biggest weaknesses might actually be a hidden weapon that no one had ever seen before.
The Hawker Typhoon was on the brink of extinction. The British Air Ministry was ready to bury the project, but the pilots on the front lines realized something that the mathematicians in London had missed. While the Typhoon was a failure at 30,000 feet, it was an absolute god at 500 feet. At low altitudes, where the air is thick and heavy, the Typhoon's massive, unreliable engine suddenly found its rhythm. It was the only plane in the Allied inventory that could outrun the German Focke-Wulf 190 in a straight line near the deck. The glitch wasn't that the plane was bad, it was that it was being used in the wrong neighborhood. The RAF decided to stop trying to make the Typhoon a gentleman's fighter and instead decided to turn it into a flying thug. The first step in this transformation was the field fix for the snapping tail. Since they didn't have time to redesign the airframe, engineers literally bolted 20 fish plate reinforcements around the rear fuselage. It was a crude, ugly solution that made the plane look like it was wearing a metal corset. But it worked. With the tail finally secure, the engineers turned their attention to the wings. The Typhoon had been built with unusually thick wings to carry 4 20mm Hispano cannons, the heaviest armament of any single-engine fighter. But they didn't stop there. In a move that defied every aerodynamic law of the time, they decided to bolt 8 high-velocity RP-3 rockets underneath those wings. Each rocket carried a 60-pound warhead. To put that in perspective, a single salvo from a Typhoon had the destructive power of a broadside from a naval destroyer. The Typhoon was no longer an interceptor, it had become the world's first true fighter-bomber. But this new power came with a terrifying price. Launching rockets from a plane traveling at 400 miles per hour was like trying to fire a cannon from a roller coaster. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate, often spiraling wildly off target.
To hit anything, Typhoon pilots had to fly down the throat of the enemy, diving at a 60-degree angle and holding the plane steady while every anti-aircraft gun on the ground was pointed directly at their nose. The Typhoon's thick skin and heavy engine acted like a shield, allowing it to soak up damage that would have vaporized a Spitfire. As the invasion of Europe approached, these Tiffy squadrons became a secret society of low-level hunters. They developed cab-rank tactics, where flights of Typhoons would circle over the battlefield like predatory birds, waiting for a radio call from a ground controller. The moment a German Tiger tank appeared, the Typhoons would drop from the clouds in a screaming vertical dive. This was the birth of modern close air support. The failure had been reborn as a 7-ton sledgehammer designed for one purpose: to erase the German Panzer divisions from the face of the earth. The stage was now set for the most violent display of air-to-ground power in history, as the scrap heap plane was about to face the ultimate test in the fields of France. By the summer of 1944, the German army was in full retreat across France, but they were far from defeated. They were moving thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and fuel trucks through a narrow corridor known as the Falaise Pocket. The German High Command believed they could escape under the cover of the morning mist, confident that Allied artillery couldn't reach them. They were wrong. They hadn't accounted for the cab rank. High above the clouds, squadrons of Hawker Typhoons were circling in a relentless holding pattern, their pilots breathing pure oxygen, their wings heavy with 60-pound rockets. When the mist cleared, the order came through the radio: total interdiction. What followed was not a dogfight, it was a mechanical execution. The Typhoons dived out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, the screaming whine of their 24-cylinder engines acting like a psychological siren. They didn't target individual soldiers, they targeted the choke points. By destroying the lead and rear vehicles of a German convoy, the Typhoons created a killing zone where hundreds of Tiger and Panther tanks were trapped with nowhere to go. Then the rockets were unleashed. A single hit from an RP-3 rocket didn't just disable a tank, it would tear the turret completely off its mount and flip 60 tons of steel into the air like a coin. The accuracy was terrifying because the pilots were firing from point-blank range, pulling up so late that they often flew through the explosions of their own targets. The devastation was so absolute that it fundamentally changed the psychology of the German soldier. This became known as Typhoon Terror. German tank crews, the most elite and battle-hardened men in the Wehrmacht, began to suffer from a collective breakdown. They knew their thick armor, which could almost stop any Allied tank shell, was useless against a vertical rocket strike. It reached a point where at the mere sound of a Typhoon's engine, entire crews would abandon their perfectly functional Panther tanks and flee into the woods, preferring to face the infantry than stay inside their steel coffins. In one afternoon, the Typhoon squadrons claimed over 150 German tanks destroyed, paralyzing the Nazi retreat and effectively ending the Battle of Normandy. When General Eisenhower walked through the remains of the Falaise Pocket weeks later, he described it as a scene of ruin that was unmatched in the war. The roads were choked with the charred skeletons of the Third Reich's pride. The Hawker Typhoon, the plane that was supposed to be a failed scrap heap project, had become the single most decisive tactical weapon in the Allied arsenal. It proved a brutal lesson in warfare. Perfection in the air is secondary to raw, violent power on the ground. The flying sledgehammer had not only saved itself from the junkyard, it had broken the back of the German army and paved the road to Berlin.